So this past week, I was out of the office for a few days for a study summit where I was trying to, get away to get ahead and read and pray and plan. I've done that for the last, 10, 15 years, and it's been really helpful. About 7 years ago, I was away doing that, reading and studying and preparing. And one of the downsides is I'm by myself, so I eat a lot of sandwiches that I make. And I ate one sandwich, and I was like, something's off about this. I was halfway through the sandwich before I realized I forgot to take the plastic off the cheese. And that happened one more time that week. I say that because it's not good for man to be alone. I just discovered this guy recently. His name's Victor Dorman, and he was actually the guy who invented the plastic that goes on the cheese. He died. I read his obituary. He made it in the New York Times because he revolutionized the cheese industry. He died at 80 in Florida, and that's all that we know about him. That's all that was in his obituary, is that he revolutionized the cheese industry because he invented the plastic that goes around cheese. And I'm sure he was a fine human being and maybe a wonderful person, but here's my question for you. When your obituary is written, is that what you want to be known for? David Brooks, he's a columnist for the New York Times, he's written a lot of books on this. He says there's a difference between our values that are resume values. That's the kind of values that, you put on a resume, the kind of values that when you walk into a room and meet somebody, you don't want them looking down on you. In fact, you might be able to look down on them. There's a difference between those kind of values and what he calls eulogy values. Eulogy is a Greek word that means a good word, as in what people say at your funeral. There's a difference between resume values and eulogy values. And as someone who's been asked to speak at a lot of funerals, I can tell you that there's no overlap really between those things. People never ask me to talk about resume values at eulogy moments. And here's the great irony of it all. We spend our days and our lives pursuing resume. But our life, the stuff that we say really matters to us. The eulogy values often get neglected. And the great irony is, if you were to sit down anybody in this room and ask us what our deepest commitments are, we would probably all say something like, follow Jesus, build bridges, make disciples. But how you spend your days, of course, is how you spend your life. So do our values, do our daily values, do our daily commitments match our convictions? We'll come back to that. So we've been going through the Gospel of Matthew for over 9 months now, and as long as God allows me to preach, I hope I get to go through a gospel with y'all every 2 or 3 years, because we religious people, we drift, don't we? It's so easy for the stuff on the side to become the most important stuff. And the stuff on the side can be anything. It can be what color we paint whatever we're going to paint next, or what songs we want to sing and what songs we don't want to sing. And we drift, we get away from the center. And that's why Matthew's been so great, at least for me, because Matthew has more face time with Jesus than any other gospel, more red letters of Jesus. There's more of Jesus' teaching in it. And for the first few hundred years, it was seen as a manual of discipleship for the early Christians. And you want to know what they would do? They would actually do this stuff. They would not read, when Jesus says, when you fast from food, they would not read that and be like, now what's the Greek word for fasting? They would fast from food. Now some of you think I'm talking about fast food. I'm not. I'm talking about they would actually not eat, because that was one thing that Jesus said to do. When Jesus says, when your brother or sister sins against you, you have to forgive them 70 times 7. They wouldn't have done, you know what, that's a callback to Genesis 4 and the Code of Lamech, and how that's a very interesting Bible thing to know. No, they would have known, man, when people wrong you, no matter how many legitimate excuses you've got, if Jesus is the king of your life, you have to do for others what he did for you. Because Jesus is not just giving us good information. He's the king. He's giving us orders. And because of the kind of king he is, he's also giving us choices. Have you noticed over the last 9 months as we've gone through this, how many different choices there are? Easy or hard yoke? You want a house built on sand or on rock? There's a narrow path or a wide path. You can get in or stay out of the boat. One of the reasons I love Matthew's gospel is because it's a wisdom gospel. Now, that does not mean what modern Americans think it does. We often think wisdom is intelligence, but it's not. It goes along with it sometimes. But wisdom is to look ahead. It is to look ahead, and in light of what you see coming, what your path is on, what your life path is on, to make choices that you will like the direction your life is headed. And if you see ahead that there are problems, to have the courage and conviction to make changes. So over and over again, Jesus is trying to let us know, if you build your house on sand, it will crumble. If you go down that road, it will lead to destruction. If you go down this road, it will lead to great fruit. And toward the end of his sermon, as we close out this series on the Gospel of Matthew today, towards the end of it, here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. That is a strong word. Not everybody who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of God. These are people who think they're good. They're evildoers, and they don't even know it. That is a very convicting, sobering passage, isn't it? And I'm glad Jesus says it, because there's some stuff at stake here. Jesus is letting you know you need to be self-aware. Do your convictions really match your commitments? The life you say, the things that you believe, or the things you think you believe, are you living that out? I mean, the very next words Jesus is going to talk about, he's going to talk about we started the Sermon on the Mount with the end of it, so it's a little bit confusing, but this is the end right now. He says, if you build a house on sand, it's going to fall. If you build a house on rock, it's going to stand. Okay. And then he ends by saying, therefore, any of you who put these words of mine into practice. I've been walking for the last 20 years with people who walk away from faith in Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of reasons they do that. Okay. Sometimes it's suffering. Interestingly, it's almost never their suffering. It's suffering they see other people go through. Sometimes there's intellectual stuff. But the number one reason that people walk away from faith is us. And I'm tired of defending Christians for not being much like Jesus Christ. And by the way, I think Jesus is too. That's what Jesus is saying. Not everybody who says, I mean, Jesus, didn't we vote our Christian values? Jesus, didn't we show up to church a lot? No, Jesus is saying very specifically, this is a way of life. Put these words of mine into practice. Okay, so Jesus has what in the first century was called a yoke. All rabbis had a yoke. Yoke is a little bit odd for us because it's an agrarian society metaphor, but basically it was what they put on two pair of oxen to keep them going in a line. It was the set of their teachings, but more than that, it was how to live. Like how to be married, how to not be married, how to view your body, how to view your life, how to view your money. That was a rabbi's yoke. What was different about Jesus' yoke was that he says his is easy, his burden will be light. And then Jesus has disciples. Now that's one of our core parts of our mission. We are going to become more like Jesus. We're going to make disciples and be a disciple. But I think in the religious South, that word needs some translation. Because we think, well, that's just what we're supposed to say. That's a church word. That's something we do on Sunday mornings for an hour. The word disciple, or talmudine is the word it would have been in the Hebrew, means apprentice. It means you're going to become like Jesus. To be one of Jesus' talmudine is to be with Jesus. This means habits, like maybe for you it's morning time or evening time or time that you take away every day, but be with Jesus. This is the living Lord, and you get to be with him. To become like Jesus. He wants to give you the kind of power through the Holy Spirit to be like him. Okay. And out of that, you live like Jesus. You live your life as if Jesus would live it if he was living in you. The whole point of apprenticeship is to model your life by Jesus. He can heal your soul. Did you know that in the Bible, in the gospel, when it says Jesus saved this person, and then another story, a chapter later, it says Jesus healed this person, it's the same word. The word salvation, it comes from that word salve, like ointment that you would put on people's wounds. Jesus is actually trying to heal our souls and our lives through his way. Now, the mistake that we make is that we think that, what we're going to do, we're going to love our enemies. We're going to forgive. We're going to go the extra mile. If somebody slaps us, we're going to turn the other cheek. We got that. We can do that, Jesus. And then we don't practice. And then somebody slaps us. And you'll go to reach for that forgiveness and turning to the other cheek, and you'll find the resources aren't there. Here's what Jesus wants you to know. If you want to experience the life of Jesus, you have to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. See, the Western church, I think we have mostly thought, okay, it's what we think. We can get the ideas of Jesus in here and what we do or don't do, the ethics of Jesus. But it's so much more than that. It's a way of life based on Jesus himself. So the early Christians called Christianity the way. They didn't call it Christianity. They called it the way. And if you want to experience Jesus, the life to the full, you need to take on his habits, which is, what a lot of times people call like spiritual disciplines, but I like spiritual habits. Like, okay, think about this. Isn't it odd, because we just went through a gospel, isn't it odd that Jesus is thought of as a teacher, but the gospels are written as biographies? I mean, they've got a lot of teaching in it, but it's telling you about how Jesus lived his actual life. And here's why. Because if you respect somebody a lot, you will probably read their biography. Let's say you're an Apple fan, so you read Steve Jobs' biography. Or let's say, because Bill Clinton grew up in Arkansas, you read, My Life or whatever. And if you want to be like them, you know what you do? You find the stuff that they did, and you do it. If you want to live like them, if they went to law school, you try to go to that law school. If they take naps in the afternoon to maximize productivity, you take naps in the afternoon. By the way, Jesus took naps. Follow Jesus. Take a nap. Right? Yeah, that's good. I told you this is gospel. It's good news, guys. No, but like you adopt their lifestyle. You try to be like them. So Jesus constantly is telling people no. So he can tell people yes. He's intentional about the way he lives. You don't have to do, you have to do some work in translating it from first century Palestine to today, but it's this lifestyle that Jesus is giving. Now, interestingly enough, Jesus never commands any of his habits except for prayer. He assumes a lot, like, for example, fasting, but he's trying to show you this is how God in the flesh lived a human life. And you can live this kind of life. These are spiritual disciplines. Now listen, here's where we go off the track, and especially in churches of Christ, because some of us, we have a tendency to short circuit stuff and maybe think it's a means to an end. It's a means to another end. It is not, these are not the end in themselves, right? You're not praying to prayer. You're not fasting to fast. You're doing this for God, in service to God, to connect with and receive the power of the Holy Spirit. If you do it the other way, it's what the Pharisees did. That equals death, not life. But in the New Testament, the number one metaphor for the Christian life was athletics. And everybody here gets this, right? Let's say that you're here today and you want to be able to bench press your own body weight, but you cannot. You could. Chances are you can, but you just can't now. So what would you do? Well, you could start tomorrow morning by doing 5 push-ups or 10 push-ups. And then maybe next week, you might find you've been able to do 15 or 20. And over the course of a few months, what was previously impossible and unthinkable now is doable. Because you have tapped into access to a certain kind of power. If God can be known, really, then why doesn't our pursuit of Him reflect something like this? Why do uncommon habits? Why is it so like? I mean, think of if we just thought through our daily habits and our daily routines. The stuff that I'm talking about seems so extreme. Except pay attention to our world and our lives. I mean, how would your life be different if this was the central of it? If this was the center of it? In light of the cross and the truth of eternity, this sounds like the only practical way to live. Now, if status quo works for you, then okay, I get it. Just keep, coming to church, doing those things. But some of you, it doesn't. And maybe you're the people God has a word for today. So 12 years ago, a little over 12 years ago, Leslie was very pregnant with Samuel. She was in like the 9th month, the 3rd trimester, the you did this to me phase of pregnancy. And I was pretty overweight at the time. And Eden, who's just a couple of years old, comes up to me one day, puts her hand on my stomach and says, "Hi, baby brother." Yeah. So that was my rock bottom. How was yours? And one of the privileges I have, honestly, of getting invited into people's lives is that I get to see people when they hit rock bottom. I do live on the consequence side of the equation. And one of the great graces that I get to see regularly is that when people hit rock bottom, they discover the rock. And if you've discovered that nagging sense that habit has turned into an addiction, if you are noticing that anger problem that you hated in your mom, you're starting to see in the mirror, if there's this constant low-grade sense of anxiety around you, if you find yourself always having to turn to TV or Netflix to medicate, whatever, just not thinking about that, if there's just a general sense of malaise, then I encourage you to take Jesus seriously. Because do you realize, this guy, he's the most stunning person who's ever lived. He's changed human history, and the next 50 people behind him don't even come close, combined. I mean, he split human history in half. The world is filled with his fingerprints. This guy has changed everything. And then we find out he's not just some guy. He's God in the flesh who's lived in us, who chose to live as a human being. And he's trying to show you how to do for your life what he has done for this world. And so that's what he's doing in Matthew from everything. And it's so practical from everything on how not to be anxious, like we talked about a few weeks ago. How not to be anxious, be grateful. Just look in your past, look around you, see what God has done for you in the past. Gratitude and anxiety cannot coexist. That's what Jesus is saying. It's how to treat women. How to treat women not like objects to be used. How to treat men and women with honor as made in the image of God. And Jesus over and over again is trying to get us to be self-aware. Like that's what Matthew is. Matthew 18 is Jesus talking about how to do conflict in community. First, be aware of yourself. When you judge people, make sure you're looking at yourself first, because by the way, when you go have conflict, they're going to look at you really closely. Jesus has given us really practical stuff on how to live the best possible kind of life. And the problem is, because I grew up here, in Arkansas, so many of us are cultural Christians. Our parents, our grandparents believed it. It was something that was a veneer on the life we already wanted to live. And we just stamp Jesus' name on it. And we don't want to be a Talmudim. We don't want to be an apprentice. For the simple fact that Jesus will ruin your life. Come on, you know that. At least he'll ruin the plans you had for your life. Because Jesus isn't trying to get invited into your life. He's trying to invite, your life's a dumpster fire more than likely. He's trying to invite you into his life. And the good news is you really can be this kind of person. That's what Matthew's trying to say. The good news, when it says repent, that's good news. It means change is possible. You can be the kind of person who's filled with love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. Can you imagine? Can you imagine when your spouse says something that offends you, not blowing up in anger? Can you imagine when your kids irritate you, being able to respond with grace? Can you imagine the kind of peace that involves with not having any enemies? At least not any of the human kind of enemies. Can you imagine the kind of joy that comes from stepping off the treadmill of endless consumption and status envy?
Lord Jesus.
Can you imagine a life filled with hope and not crushing despair? Because what I just described is not extraordinary. It is the ordinary experience of millions of Talmudim of Jesus Christ throughout human history. So Matthew is about choices because your life is about choices. And Jesus wants you to pay attention to the direction that your choices are heading in. He wants you to pay attention to your assumptions about who you are and what kind of world you are in and what you're paying attention to. So like the wise men at the very beginning of the gospel, the wise men, they hear about a new king being born. So they go to Jerusalem, and it turns out it's a problem because there's an old king who's still living. And they ask him about it, and he's like, oh, I'd very much like to know. King Herod, I'd very much like to know about this new king. Why don't you find out where he is so I can worship him too? And the wise men have a choice to make. So they go and they find the baby Jesus. Which reality are they going to believe? That this little baby born in a cave is king? Or the one that's sitting on a throne in an actual palace that has all the prestige, authority, and power? What are they going to choose? Fast forward 13 years and 30 years and 13 chapters, and that little baby has grown up. And he tells a story in Matthew chapter 13 that I think is fascinating. In verse 44, he says, the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up, and then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all he had and bought it. Now think about this. This guy who finds this, the choice seems pretty clear. By the way, that was a common thing. They didn't have banks on every corner back in the day. And so people would bury their treasure, their life savings, and then often they would die. And nobody knew. And so that's what happened. And Jesus is telling a story in which everybody would get like, oh, wow. So the guy has to, he's got a choice to make, right? What's he going to do? I want to imagine what you would do. So this isn't too ludicrous to think of. Like 9 years ago in February 2013, there was a couple that was walking on some property that they owned. And all of a sudden they stubbed their toe on what seemed to be like an old coffee can. And so they dug around it. And in Saddle Ridge, they found this. They found later 8 more cans. Those are 18th century gold coin, $10 gold coins, the largest buried treasure ever discovered in American soil. Go to the next one. They found tens of thousands of these, worth over $10 million. Okay, so if you grew up in Central Arkansas, maybe you guys, I don't know, did y'all hear the legend of Ponce de Leon? Y'all hear? Like he was around here, and he was looking for the Fountain of Youth. That's right. I kid you not, when I was a little kid, Mom would tell me those stories, and I would look for it. Maybe because I was thinking, like, if I could get that to Mom and shave a few years off, she might be less cranky or something. But I love this because this is a human dream, right? We all dream of finding buried treasure. And Jesus is using one of these amazing metaphors to say, it's right there. You're just not looking hard enough. Do you know that in Churches of Christ, Amish people are like our distant cousins? Like we're related to them. We have the same theological instincts in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, that's really good because I think they take the way of Jesus very seriously. The practices of the way of Jesus. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said they had recently visited an Amish community. And did you know that when you were born, even when you're a teenager, you're not considered Amish? Before you can be Amish, you have to have this thing called a Rumspringer. Has anybody ever heard of Rumspringer? Okay, Rumspringer is basically this. When you're 18 years old, you are raised up as Amish, even though you're not considered Amish. But when you're 18 years old, you are sent away to go wherever you want, to live however you want. That's actually where we get the phrase, sowing your wild oats. And then at the end of a year, if you choose to come back and live with them, you have chosen the way of Jesus, and specifically that particular kind of way of Jesus. And every night while they're away, the family sets a plate at the dinner table for the child who's gone. And I like that a lot, because the way of Jesus cannot be compelled. It cannot be coerced.
That's right.
It can't be voted in and forced. This is the Churches of Christ instinct. This is why we have insisted on adult baptism, because we believe the way of Jesus is something that you choose to bend your knee to. Not that it's not real for everyone, but it is not. You're not allegiant to it until you decide, I'm going to pledge my allegiance to this above any other. This is my choice that informs all other choices. And parents, I want you to know, your kids are watching what your choices are, and they will follow you in your real choices, not the ones you tell them are important to you. But think about this guy. The guy who buys the field, he's taking a risk. He's got to liquidate all his assets, right? He's got to sell everything. And what if it turns out the pearl is fake? What if somebody else came and got the jewelry while he was gone? But his overwhelming response is not anxiety. What is it? Joy. Which brings me back to those wise men. Because when they see the baby in the cave, their overwhelming response as they choose that king instead of the other one is joy. The theme of the Gospel of Matthew is joy. Jesus, they have to choose. The wise men have to choose. They could listen to the dominant reality that most have chosen, but they go against their better instincts. And it says they were overwhelmed with joy, which is exactly what the man who sowed the field experienced. And this is the point Matthew's trying to make. There are a lot of intelligent sounding reasons why why Jesus sounds out of tune with reality. You can explain him away pretty well. In fact, a large percentage of people manage to do that. But with those who have ears to hear, this is an invitation to a different reality. And it will cost you everything, but it is worth every cent. Because as the wise men found out, Jesus is the pearl, and he's worth the risk. So the point of Matthew's gospel is not what you do. It's never been that. It's about what has been done for you. This is how Matthew starts off. I mean, think of it this way. If you were drowning in a lake, and I threw you a manual to learn how to swim, that's not that helpful, right? We said this is the manual of discipleship, but it doesn't come first. What came first was the rescue. God became one of us to show us how to live, He did what we could not do. It's not just God saying, try harder. It's saying something by the Spirit of God you can do. It's about what God is up to, and you can join him in it. Don't miss out. Don't come to the end of your life and be known for inventing something to help make cheese better. Make sure your values match your commitments. So what do you say? Yes or no? Buy or sell? Every day is a chance, and every hour is an opportunity. So how will you spend yours?